Well, this is the circuit I've been working on of late. I was seeking an understanding of how to add current to the circuit, and I had to accept the fact that current cannot be added to this circuit. It is merely a voltage build-up device that does not require any input to build up a significant or infinite voltage if you wait long enough, but at the cost of current and at the cost of power. So the total wattage is like in the picowatt range, but the voltage could be anything you want it to be if you wait long enough. Literally anything. And the more resistance there is in the wire, to some degree, a moderate amount of resistance, the more voltage builds up. Instead of actually deterring the buildup, it actually encourages it. Only one, well, how shall I call this? Emblematic sphere. I mean, it's not really a sphere anymore. It's an electrical equivalent to a sphere with a spark gap in the middle, two capacitors on either side, and then a ring, a circular ring of two inductors on the outside. And the inductors, in this case, are mild. They're like 1 microhenry. And the capacitors are extremely small capacitance, 135 femto farads, which means you could probably use plate glass, and then electroplate both sides with a thin film of metallic plate material, to be your plates. Now, I'm not sure about this coil, this paracoils, this transformer over here, whether or not it's needed. Because it doesn't matter what the inductance is, doesn't matter what the coupling coefficient, the magnetic coupling is, just as long as it's there. Creating an isolated circuit over here on the right, and then a ground to the left, using a capacitor of the same value over here, 135 femtofarads, to protect the voltage, so that all the voltage nodes, like here on the coil, are protected from zeroing out to ground. Now I put a diode in here, and I almost felt obligated. I felt obligated to put the coil there and to turn it into a transformer, because that's how I got inspired to do this, was to think in terms of the Amann brothers. They had a steel drum, big round drum, had to be a coil in there because they said there was wire in there. Could be a paracoils, could be a transformer situation, I don't know. And then the inspiration for this ability to translate the Amann brothers story into an electrical equivalent comes courtesy of William Beatty on Quora, who was talking about Tesla coils and the ball on the end, the sphere at the top. And I thought, oh wow, that looks like the Amann brothers, because he put one on either end of the coil, which is a little unusual for a Tesla coil. And then I thought of the Amann brothers. Well, it turns out you don't need both spheres. You only need one if you do this way of converting one of them into a non-spherical electrical equivalent. Now, I don't know if it'll work with just one sphere. Possibly, I don't know. I would imagine the inside of the sphere would be hollow. But in any event, I think it's better to go the route of an electrical equivalent because it's more efficient. You can get better results, and that's, I think, the way Tesla would have gone with it, because I think he replicated what the Amann brothers did. And what the Amann brothers did anyway was take the Tesla coil that Tesla invented and put it out there in the public sector by creating a demonstration with a little brouhaha and a newspaper reporter showing up to document it. So it kind of put Tesla on alert. Oh, maybe I should do something with this, like what they're doing, instead of just leaving it for my own private experiments of, or my agenda of transmitting, wirelessly or, through a single wire through the earth. Maybe I should think about independent power supplies for electric cars, because that's what the Amann brothers did. So I don't know. It might have influenced him. In any case, I had to justify the use of this circuit somehow. And what helps is there's a little tidbit in the Amon Brothers story. And if we composite the Amon Brothers story with the Tesla Pierce Arrows story 10 years later in 1931 and the Amon Brothers in 1921, we get a slightly more better image of what's going on. Peter Savo claimed that Tesla was using 12 radio tubes. I think they were 12 vacuum tube capacitors, because Tesla invented those things, and it looks to me like he had somebody custom making them in Buffalo, New York. That's why he bought them there. And there may be a loose connection as to why they were never commercialized until a year before he died, because he didn't want anybody else to have them. Let's see. And the aerial on the back is of the Pierce Arrow is significant, because without a ground, this circuit won't work. Its source of energy is the spark gap of all things. If you go into the macro, the simulator macro for a spark gap, a neon bulb spark gap, there actually is a voltage source, a couple of them, in the macro. And there's other things like capacitors and resistors and whatnot, and inductors. But interestingly enough, there is a voltage source there. And so when I took away all my voltage sources, and well, I didn't have any to begin with, when I took away the pre-charge condition on one capacitor, you know, I tried various things. I tried, okay, what if I put a pre-charge on all the capacitors? What about on only two? Oh, what about on none of them? And surprise, surprise, the thing worked just as well without any pre-charge. And then it took me a while for my brain to realize, oh yeah, I've gone into the macro for a spark gap, and it has voltage sources. So apparently, you know, in the environment, there's always a voltage charge of some amount, right? When I first started I actually did experiments. It's hard to imagine, right? I do nothing but simulations now. Maybe because my experiment was such a failure. This was back in April of 2013, and I went to the first conference that I went to was the summer of 2013, and I asked Mark McKay, he was in the audience. I think he gave a presentation on the EV Gray motor, but he was in the audience for the rest of the conference, and I asked him, you know, I did this analog computer experiment, and I hooked up I was trying to see if I could use it as a power amplifier, because I've been thinking this along these lines for 7 years, and I hooked it up to a flue that came out of a water heater, and it was 20 feet tall, because it was a guest house with a very tall roof. It was a single-story guest house, but the roof was very high. It was a vaulted ceiling. And so the flue on the outside to match, or to go slightly higher than the roof, I think I'd estimate was 20 feet tall, but it was grounded. As I tested it electrically, it was grounded to the water pipes that went into the water heater. And the flue was a grounded instrument, yet it developed half a volt, despite the fact that it was grounded, or maybe because it was grounded, I don't know. It was galvanized, whatever. Anywho, so I had my circuit hooked up to that single line as my ground source, because I didn't want to have to go to the trouble of pounding a grounding rod into the earth. I already had a grounding source. And I hooked it up, and it was a tiny little circuit on a perforated experimental board, you know. And I had a whole series of daisy-chained LMD modules, you know, of small little capacitors, small little radio choke coils I got from a radio shop nearby, because that's exactly what, you know, Eric Dolly said, radio choke coils and capacitors. So I had a little ceramic capacitors. I had no switches, nothing. Just, you know, I don't know, several daisy chains, let's say 3, 4, I don't know how many I had, and nothing happened. And when I was sizing up in my brain what's going on, what am I doing wrong, I only had limited components to choose from. And when I spoke to Mark McKay, I said, you know what I think I did wrong? My capacitance was too high and my inductance was too low, and he agreed with me. I was blocking the flow of current, because I would take my little voltmeter and measure each module in the daisy chain, and it got no further than the first module. It didn't proceed to the end.
or didn't even proceed to the second module, let alone to the end. So he agreed with me. Yeah, that's probably what went wrong. So this kind of alerted me to the fact that, trial and error on the bench is really time consuming, and you got to go through so many different options. And I just gave up. And it wasn't until 4 years later that I realized, watching a movie, that, hey, I can do a simulation. It'll save me time. I can make changes. It's safe. I don't have to worry about electrocuting myself. And it really cuts down the learning curve. Well, it's taken me close to 4 years now of simulating to develop the skill requisite to perform over Unity of one kind or another and understand it, be able to analyze it. And this circuit really baffled me because it has no current to speak of. It's like nanovolts to speak of. And that, a nano is 1/billionth of a volt. And yet it can build up any amount of voltage you want. It's just the current is always pretty much in the same ballpark, probably because the simulator crashes at around, it varies between 1 to 3,000 seconds of simulation time, virtual simulation time. So I never get to find out, how far can I go, because, infinity for a simulator is limited to 1 to the 100 or 200 units, so I can only take it so far. But that's a lot of voltage. Still, the amps tends so when it crashes, I really don't get to find out how far I get to go with the amps, which is what I'm interested in. The problem is there's no amps here to speak of, so maybe I'm thinking all wrong. All these good regeneration techniques for dead batteries require high voltage, low current pulses, right? And I'm thinking to myself, maybe I got this all wrong. Maybe I should forget about the amps. Whatever amps is there, just think of it as a trickle charge. Whoops. And just think of voltage is the only thing I got to worry about. Well, it's already taken care of, so why am I pushing what cannot be? Why am I forcing something into this circuit that cannot happen? Leave it. Leave it alone. I can get 4 kilovolts of buildup in 15 minutes on both terminals of this dead battery, which I've put at the value of 1 femtovolt. Is it femto? Or is it less than a femto? Well, let's see. 5 groups of 3. So milli, micro, nano, pico, femto. Yeah. 1 femtovolt. I like to do that on dead batteries, whether or not it's true for a dead battery. 1 femtovolt on the dead battery, and I can build it up. Each terminal will be 4 kilovolts each in 15 minutes. That's, what is that? 1,000 seconds. I think that's 1,000 seconds, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Anywho, you got to put a diode there, right? And you got to point it in the opposite direction so the battery gets charged and doesn't get discharged, or both charged and discharged, because this is an oscillating circuit. Everything I do is oscillating. I don't know how to do strictly DC over Unity circuits, and I wouldn't even try because I wouldn't even know where to begin. So everything I do is based on oscillations, because then I get leverage via electrical reactance, which is strictly frequency, capacitance, and inductance. And there's no energy involved directly, only as a consequence indirectly. So we get our free energy indirectly by doing a back-end run, like a quarterback, loop-de-loop. I won't go through that pile of bodies, I'll just go around them. And this is what we do. We create free energy by going around the free energy. And we end up getting free energy anyway. Because we only try to manipulate electrical reactance and we don't touch the energy. And electrical reactance is potential energy, because the definition of the electromagnetic spectrum of frequencies, X-rays, infrared, all those ranges, audio range, all those ranges, radio waves, microwaves, that's considered potential energy. If you read very carefully the Wikipedia article, you realize that's what it is. It's potential energy. So we are manipulating, at the very least, the frequency aspect of electrical reactance. We are manipulating potential energy. And the so-called conservation law of energy is a misnomer. They dropped, lawyers do it all the time. If they were to state things accurately, it would be a very long, accurate statement, but they always keep dropping the important words, so that we mislead ourselves in the vacuum of knowledge, the ignorance that is presented to us, the partial knowledge. It's not disinformation so much as lack of information. And we make up the difference by fantasizing. So we call it conservation of energy, and that's bogus. It's conservation of kinetic energy. There's no such thing as conservation of potential energy. Try and stand up a physicist to the wall and pin him with that one and see how far he wiggles. He ain't going to wiggle anywhere. It's conservation of kinetic energy. While electrical reactants, we're free to do whatever we want to because there's no such thing as conservation of potential energy. It does not exist. Forget it. Ask a physicist, does conservation of potential energy exist? Well, not exactly. Well, he can't say yes, because it doesn't. Because it can't. You can do whatever you want to frequency, capacitance, and inductance, and no one's going to stand in your way and give you a ticket or a citation and send you to jail. It just ain't going to happen. Unless you're stupid and they're stupid, and you go along with this collective stupidity. Now, in the Amon brothers' story, they're actually asked what's inside the steel drum. And he says, iron, wire, and a mineral. That's it. And he claims he's getting energy from the air. Well, yeah, if his sphere is, getting the ambient voltage from the air, I mean, how much do you need to get the thing kick-started, you know? All you need is a ground. You gotta have the ground. And if he has an aerial, if he has an aerial on his car, which he does, and he's grounded this thing to the aerial, he's already taken out the headlights and replaced them with the copper spheres or brass spheres, bronze spheres, whatever they are. If Tesla did the same thing, and he put a 2-meter aerial on the backside of the Pierce Arrow, you gotta have a ground. Without a ground, this thing won't work. It won't fly. You don't have to put energy into this thing because it's already going to get a very mild voltage. It's going to pick up, from the atmosphere. And because of the configuration of the thing, it's going to build up. The center of the sphere is emulated here by a spark gap. It's going to build up first it's going to ionize across the spark gap, and then it's going to eventually build up enough voltage that it's going to kick that spark gap into firing mode, and then the whole thing takes off. It'll just explodes. But you gotta have a ground somewhere to dump your trickle charge of current, transferring your voltage to someplace off the circuit in order for it to function. Otherwise, it ain't gonna function. It'll just die. It'll never get started in the first place. So certain elements you gotta have. You gotta have a ground. You got to have a hollow sphere or the electrical equivalent to a hollow sphere. You might have to have a coil here. And then this is extra. Now, you don't need a diode. But if you're doing something to the battery pack, you're going to need a diode, right? And that's the only way I could see. I'll show you. I changed my desktop. It used to be a little erotic, so I won't tell you what was on my desktop. But what I have now is the periodic table of the elements, and I decided, you know what, I gotta get this in front of my face, and I gotta figure out intuitively what mineral did the Amon brothers use, because I began to realize it's an important element of the story. It's not important, obviously, to develop voltage, but what did they do with that voltage? What's it good for? So I had to figure out. So I decided, okay, they said a mineral. All right, but mineral 100 years ago can mean a raw product from the earth that has not been processed. You pick up, you dig with your hands, and what do you get? You get something, and there are common terms for what comes out of the earth because it has not been processed yet. Clay, for instance, very often can be called potassium aluminosilicate, because that's chemically what it is, or just plain aluminosilicate. Actually, clay is, it doesn't have the potassium in there. Aluminosilicate, which is a combination of aluminum, silica, and a few other things, oxygen, but the common term is clay. And you could call that a mineral, I guess. You could call salt a mineral, yet it's made up of sodium on the one hand and chloride on the other. So it is a little more complicated if you get into the chemistry of the thing, but 100 years ago, I'm sure they used a common term for a common thing you commonly get out of the earth that has not been processed. So, chemically, it's going to be complicated. All right? We can presume that. All right? That's allowable. So it doesn't have to be a single element from the periodic chart of the elements. It can be a combination of them, making up a common so-called mineral you can mine from the earth. What could it be? Could it be something from the left-hand side, sodium, potassium, lithium? Ooh, lithium looks like a possibility. Is it from the right-hand side? Well, it's not a noble gas. Could it be fluorine, chlorine? Ooh, fluorine, calcite, or fluorite? Maybe. Could it be carbon? Ooh, nitrogen, carbon, phosphorus, sulfur. Ooh, how about gold, silver? Ooh, how about mercury? Maybe mercury's swimming around in that steel drum. And then we get this middle zone, silica. Isn't silica pretty important for our little, silicon wafer chips, microchips, because it's a semiconductor? Now, carbon, if you put carbon into rubber, it makes the rubber a semiconductor. Next door to the silica is aluminum. Interesting. Then over here we got boron. Now there's a website. Let's see, I'm not going to bring it up. But I'll show you how you can get to it. And the guy is really interesting. I first got introduced, he hasn't made changes to his website in years, and yet he still has it up on the web. And one of his articles that introduced me to him was an article on magnifying amplifiers, mag amps. But in that article, he talks about borax diodes. The old-timers used to make diodes out of borax or baking soda in a water solution dissolved in water, and then two electrodes. Normally they would use, one electrode was lead. It doesn't matter what the other electrode is, but they chose to use a lead electrode. But the important one was aluminum. And in the presence of the baking soda or the borax, the aluminum develops an aluminum oxide coating if you run an AC current through that little condenser. It's like the old style condensers, capacitors in the old days weren't like now. There were different style of condensers. They were empty bottle condenser with just air as the dielectric, or Tesla invented a vacuum tube orientation, or they could be an electrolyte, which Tesla did use in Colorado Springs. He used champagne bottles filled with salt water, and they served as his capacitor. He had a plate on an electrode on the inside and an electrode on the outside, and he had rows and columns of champagne bottles in a wooden box. And then he had to vent the hydrogen out to the outside of the building, so he wouldn't, get an explosion with all the high voltages inside the building. But there are different ways of doing it, see? So you can have a capacitor with an electrolyte solution, but you can also have a diode, because one of the two electrodes is going to develop an oxide coating, preventing flow of current in one direction but allowing it in the other. And so this is what came to mind. Baking soda is a raw mineral. It's called trona. It's mined from the desert in the southwest California. Trona, that's the name of the raw product. It's actually sodium carbonate is what it is. And then they infuse it with bicarbonation to make it sodium bicarbonate to sell it to us in the grocery store. Or they sell it as is, sodium carbonate, for the pool man to regulate the pH of your swimming pool. And that's called soda ash, is the other term for it. But trona is the combination. When you find it in the earth, actually, you don't find it as sodium carbonate. That's soda ash. You have to heat treat what you find in the earth to get sodium carbonate out of it. But actually in the earth, it's a combination, 1 mole of sodium carbonate and 1 mole of sodium bicarbonate in a mixed state of 50-50 blend. And you can get that if you take sodium bicarbonate and put it in water, dissolve it, and bring it to a boil. You'll end up with trona in your water, because you will have driven off half of the bicarbonation. And it's back to its raw state as you find it in the earth. Be that as it may, you can use that or you can use borax, and you end up with a diode. So this is what I think the mineral was. It was either trona or it was borax to fashion a diode. So let's go back to the photograph. And why would he need a diode? Because he's got a DC system in his old jalopy, EV conversion jalopy, the Amman brothers, not Tesla, back in 1921. And so why would he need a diode? Because he's got a DC system, and maybe he's doing something with the battery, maybe a battery pack for that electric car, or maybe he's recharging them, or maybe he's doing something for skip the battery and he's going directly to the DC motor. I don't know, and I don't have to know. All I have to try to figure out are what are the elements of the story that we know about. That we know there's a diode involved and a coil of wire, at least one coil, and two hollow copper spheres. But in reality, you only need one. You see, the other sphere will act as the ground for the first, and vice versa. So technically, you could replace one of those two spheres with an aerial, and it'll work. They didn't know any better, I guess, so they just put two spheres on there. Or maybe it has to work that way if you use a non-electrical equivalent. See, when you use an electrical equivalent, it's so powerful you don't need two spheres, because you don't have spheres anymore. And so I think spheres are kind of rudimentary. And so they're not efficient. But if you get an electrical equivalent, you increase your efficiency, and then you probably don't need two spheres. One is good enough, just so long as the other point on this dipole is an aerial grounded to the air, at least grounded to something. You know, the chassis of the car, grounded to something. So what I'm finding here is that when we process this, we get voltages that are so high immediately surrounding the spark gap. Let's see if I can zoom in here. In this case, after 1,000 seconds or 15 minutes, we get 80 megavolts, but they're matched on both terminals of the spark gap. Now, how can it fire if there's no voltage difference of 100 volts? I don't know. Maybe it doesn't fire. Maybe it just strongly ionizes. Whatever, we get the same situation around the battery. We get 4,000 volts. See that? 4.092 kilovolts on the negative on both sides. So there's no chance to see the fact that it's also different by that amount, because this is so small, you're not going to see it show up here. But trust me, it's there. When I made this 6 volts, because in the old days, 100 years ago, that was the size of a car battery, was 6 volts. It only became 12 volts later on to accommodate the additional electrical needs of a modern day car. I don't think they had a radio in the old jalopies. So, start adding a radio, an AM radio, and different things, then you need a 12 volt battery. But in the old days, they had a 6 volt battery. So this works on a 6 volt battery. I decided to make this a dead battery, so you can't see the voltage difference between the two terminals of this dead battery. Let's see what else. So what I think is going on here, in order for me to extrapolate, well, what's it good for? Is to merely bathe the battery in spikes of high voltage and low current. In fact, after 1,000 seconds, if I eliminate the first 2 seconds, because the first 2 seconds skews the tracing, because there's a 2.5 microamp surge in the negative direction that lasts for just under 2 seconds, and then it subsides. So I told the simulator, okay, forget about the first 2 seconds, and so that I can see if anything's happening. And lo and behold, something is happening. It starts to appear at around, what is that? My bad eyes. 720. Actually, earlier than that, somewhere around 550 seconds. It starts to build up little negative spikes until finally they're noticeable within these parameters of negative 15 pico. So, yeah, right. Negative 15 picoamps spikes begin to develop, and they'll keep going. Now, I've also figured out why microcap has to give us matrix's singular error message as we strive towards infinity, because of the fact that matrix's singular means divergence in the course of its analysis, or approximation, I should say, of the results. And so what it's happening is it was always divergent. It always got a high and a low, but they were close enough that it said, okay, I'll average the two and make that my data point. Well, those 2 points kept moving apart, and they also kept getting bigger. They kept moving apart because they got bigger. Duh. So they weren't moving apart. See, the simulator doesn't know the difference, because the simulator doesn't expect you to analyze a surge-oriented circuit that wants to fry itself to infinite oblivion. So all it looks for are differences between the high and the low. And if they get too divergent, you get an error message, it's fatal, and the simulator shuts down. But they're supposed to separate to a greater and greater degree because they're simply getting larger in their absolute value. The positive value gets more positive, the negative value gets more negative, and it can no longer assign an average because they're so divergent, it has decided not to average it anymore. There's a limit. You can only go so far and no further with this thing. It allows for 1 unit of difference between the two values of maximum and minimum of whatever it is trying to figure out, voltages or amperages, whatever it is. And the default is 1 milli-unit, but you can raise that relative value, Control-Shift letter G. You go into global settings. You can change that to 1 unit of divergence, and that's all you're allowed. You can't go any higher. It won't let you. So this is what's happening. So literally my intuition is correct. My vague analysis is correct. Because the more detailed analysis is that they are not diverging, they're simply getting bigger in their absolute value, which makes them look like they're diverging to a greater degree. They're not. They're simply getting bigger. And so the simulator shuts down. So you're always going to have matrices singular error fatal messages when you're trying to run a surge-oriented circuit. So you got to live with that. It's just one of the painful limitations of working in today's world, where overunity doesn't exist, conservation energy is king, and yada yada yada. We can forget that crap, okay? It deserves a cuss word, crap, because it is crap. All right, so we're getting these spikes that look like, some of them are spiky, but some of them look like square waves. Isn't that kind of squarish there? With a kind of trapezoidal with a flat bottom to it. There's a spike, but there's a flat bottom. So it's kind of interesting. And so this is like a trickle charge we're getting, despite the fact that the thing is swimming in volts. So we're trickle charging. Oh, and this is how you get the transient analysis limits. You put in your I put in 900.00000000001 seconds because that helps improve accuracy when you always deviate things and don't use integer values. That's for my maximum runtime. But my output start time, I tell it to skip the first 2 seconds so that I can skip that initial 2-second surge of 2.5 microamps. It flattens everything, and I think, oh, that's nothing interesting. It dies. No, it doesn't die. That was just an initial surge, but here it's building up again after a sufficient amount of time, and that happens sometimes with free energy circuits. And so unless you zoom in and take a closer look, you're not going to know. Are you dealing with a conventional circuit that just behaves conventionally, in which you have a surge in the beginning and the whole thing dies after that, and you wonder, oh, that's a waste? No. If you go in there and look and ignore the initial surge, you're going to find out, oh, it's developing a surge here. You just got to wait. And you got to ignore the initial surge. So this is how you get this dialog box to put in, ignore the initial 2 seconds. See, so what I did was, I go in here, right-click on this, and then I modify the scope drawing to, instead of going to 900 seconds, I go down to, what is it? I change it to maybe 10 second. No. Well, I take off zeros. So I go to 90 seconds, I go to 9 seconds. Oh, look at that. There's a surge less than 2 seconds long. And that's why I was able to find it. By bringing it in, it changed the scope here. Or if it doesn't, I do it manually. And then I was able to see, oh, I got to skip the first 2 seconds. And so now to do that, you have to go into this window, put in the 2 seconds, and you get into this window by going Alt plus the number 1, and then to close this window, you do F3, the function, the third function key. So in order to justify this thing swimming in thousands of volts, what I have to assume, and this is now speculation, is that we don't need, see, voltage is a different thing. It's a different animal. We're only trickling charge this anyway. So when you're dealing with high voltages, it's a different animal, and we're not pounding this thing with voltages, with a voltage difference of like 600 volts on one side of the terminal of the dead battery and 0 volts on the other by reference to the 600. No, we're not doing that. This is not a Bedini charger. What is it? All right, I'll tell you what this is. It has precedence. There is a story going around the internet, and it's been going around for some time, that the reason why the dinosaurs were so big was because the planet was smaller and the gravity was less. Because if you take a dinosaur in today's world, they will become extinct merely because they couldn't survive their body weight. And so that kind of gives credibility to the possibility that maybe indeed we were hit by a planetoid object or a meteorite, a very large one, in the Yucatan area, and adding to the mass of the Earth. Because the Earth is constantly adding mass. It's constantly getting meteorite, coming to the Earth and adding to the mass. And when it adds to the mass, it increases its radius. Even more so if the planet is hollow. It'll increase its radius even faster on less matter accumulation thereof. Now, so what they're saying then is that Pangaea, the single continent of the planet, was not surrounded by ocean. It was simply no ocean. Little lakes, maybe streams here and there, but no ocean. The ocean appeared only because the Pangaea broke up because the Earth was expanding in diameter, in radius. And so the water came in to fill in the gaps. So there are different things that have been happening. Now, if the planet is hollow, that means the planet is a single plate capacitor in which the single plate is on the outside, the other virtual plate is the dead center of the hollow planet. That's where a humongous amount of voltage has accumulated, transferred from the sun, which also has a hollow center with a voltage at its center of a very high potential, which has been transferred in turn from the center of our galaxy or other bigger stars, which in turn, see, there's no limit to where it came from, because there's no limit to scale in both directions. You can say, oh, there's a limit. No, nobody knows of it. Nobody's seen the limit. When it comes to physical scale, there's no limit to size, either in largesse, in bigness, or in smallness. And so we get this transference of voltage that keeps getting redistributed among smaller and smaller celestial hollow objects that are spheroidal or ellipsoidal in shape. And hey, guess what? The Amman brothers put one in here. So if we look at the fact that the Earth had a smaller diameter at one point in its history, that means the shell of the Earth would have been closer to that voltage point at the center of the planet, and that means it would have suffered or endured a higher voltage of electrostatic fields surrounding everything. Now, we get to the kicker. Aaron Murakami has a newsletter. It's very good if you sign up for it. Once in a while, he gives us little tidbits of science that has to do with electricity. It has nothing to do with the conference. It's just out there to help you know more about electricity. And one of the things he found out from some story that he found on the internet that he shared with us is that somebody did an experiment with corn seedlings. They grew corn seedlings and a few other plants in a condition of a constant high voltage. Okay? So there's no difference of potential to electrocute anything and fry it to death. It was surrounded by a high voltage. Everything was raised to a high voltage and engulfed in that high voltage throughout its germination period. And they found something very interesting to their surprise. Hidden away in the DNA of that corn is DNA telling it to grow differently under a different set of electrical conditions. When the electrostatic field is higher, it grows into a giant. Now, if we go into Vedic lore, the Vedic history of the planet tells us that this is the Kali Yuga, the fourth yuga of 4 yugas. And each yuga, the lifespan is shorter of the human by a factor of 10, the average lifespan, mind you. The previous yuga, the Treta means 3. The previous Treta yuga, the average lifespan was 1,000. Ooh, that sounds like Methuselah in the Bible. And what else does it say in the Bible? There were giants of old, and they lived longer. So what they find, these corn plants grow faster, they grow bigger when they grow under high voltage conditions. Doesn't this sound biblical? Doesn't this sound like the earth used to be smaller? It used to have less gravity, whatever gravity is, it has nothing to do with mass. It had less radius, and it had higher electrostatic potential, so dinosaurs, animals were bigger. And if the human was around, the human would have been bigger. So the dinosaurs became extinct, possibly for a multiple of factors. If a meteorite hit the Earth, it would have given us a nuclear winter, and all the plant life would have become extinct. So all the plant-eating dinosaurs would have died off, and then the Tyrannosaurus Rex would have had nothing to eat except each other, and only the small animals survived. Yeah, because all the big animals couldn't move. They'd be crushed to death. They wouldn't be able to breathe. They'd suffocate. They wouldn't even be able to take a breath or go have breakfast. So yeah, they could have died of starvation, whatever, or died seeking food, but they couldn't chase it. The Tyrannosaurus Rex would be a fool thinking he could run around anymore. The flying ones, pterodactyls, wouldn't be able to fly and flap their wings. Oh my God, my wings are so heavy. They wouldn't be able to get off the ground. So, multiple reasons could have killed them off. But it would have been a higher voltage back then. And this is how I think we extend long life. We're so busy burning ourselves up with current loss, due to emotional excitement, that we don't retain our voltage potential. And we use it up. We spend it too fast. And so I think what happened was they had an easier life. They took things more gradual, more slow, more peaceful. They didn't get so emotionally reactive. And they lived under high voltage conditions as well. And so they didn't deteriorate. They didn't have bugs and germs like we have, because under high voltage, you think they're going to survive. I don't think so. They're the first to go. And giants will replace them. So nobody was subject to diseases. So this is, I think, the value here. We don't have to think of voltage as something you hammer a dead battery with a voltage difference of high potential difference. I think, now this is a speculation, but I'm assuming that all we have to do is bathe both terminals of a battery with high voltage, and the chemistry will come alive just like the DNA does in plants and animals. Because if you look at electrodynamic behavior, it's in everything. It's in chemistry. It's in crystalline structure of rocks. It's in the salt of the ocean. Electrical behavior happens everywhere. And that's why I consider it to be the simplest modality of consciousness. When is something dead? When is something alive? It's alive all the time because it's electrical all the time. Electricity is a form of consciousness in a primordial state of development. And if we look at the situation in terms of, okay, what could regenerate a dead battery? Well, maybe immersing it in an electrostatic field of high potential on both of its terminals. And this circuit produces a trickle charge, and if we put a dead battery in an electrostatic field, maybe it'll come back to life. The chemistry will become revived. Because if you've got a high electrical reactance, you're going to have a high frequency, and that's going to speed things up. Reaction time for the chemical modification of a dead battery, you're going to speed things up. So how much trouble do you really have to go to revive a dead battery? Obviously, by the looks of things, not much. Now, the Amman brothers never said, okay, they never told us they were able to drive their car continuously. They never said that. And because nobody asked. They simply said, where does the energy come from? It comes from the air. It's a cosmic generator. So for all we know, they may have had to park the car and let it recharge itself over a certain length of time, and then they drove it until the batteries were drained. I don't know. Or, in the more fantastic scheme, if we maintain a high voltage potential on both terminals of the battery pack for this EV, maybe it's able to get by on very little expenditure of current. Because remember, when you're living in the earlier yugas, where life is more long-lived and everything is more easygoing, current flow is going to be vastly reduced. Why? Because you don't need much current when you have high voltages on both your terminals of a dipole. You don't need it. So it could be that it's possible for a battery to function, or a motor for that matter, to function on less current when it's subject. This is an electromagnetic-oriented, current-oriented battery of today's conventional standards. It may not need the same level of current when it's raised into a field, immersed in a field of high voltage potential. Now, there may be the caveat that the windings on that, the coils of that electric motor, has to be a smaller gauge number, a more wider diameter of wire to reduce its resistance, possibly. But in any event, I'm assuming that it may be possible to get by on less current. So it may be possible to drive an EV in this situation without having to stop and take weeks to revive the battery on a trickle charge, if you constantly subject the thing to high voltage continuously as you're driving, as well as before and after. You know, when you come to a stop and then you shut down. Now, it's going to take a while to build this up in the first place, so maybe you never shut it off. Maybe all you do is you disengage the circuit from the motor, put it in neutral, or disengage it from the motor, and maybe disengage it from the battery as well. Maybe the battery is not needed. I don't know, because their system was a DC system. So instead of a battery here, imagine it's the motor, or imagine this is the motor, the rotor and the stator coils. Or if it's a DC motor, actually it's going to be two rotor coils and then a permanent magnet stator. Whatever, it was a DC system, so they had to have a diode. So that's my speculation on what is this circuit good for. And it remains to be seen whether that's the case or not, I don't know. You can't get away with simulating a motor, an AC motor, this way. At least I haven't tried. Maybe I should try that. See, I'm assuming it's not possible. But maybe I'm wrong. Because they do have an AC motor module in microcap. I've just never worked with it, and I'm not sure how to work with it, but I should give it a try. Because they do have demo circuits, and I should try to... I think I have a demo circuit for the DC motor model, and then maybe that'll give me a clue as to how to work with the AC version. So I guess I got more work cut out for myself, but I thought I'd share this much that I've learned so far with you. Because this is an ongoing study, and there are problems, and some of the problems are thematic. They are not electrical. Or they're thematic first, so that we know how to proceed. Otherwise, if we don't know how to analyze the situation, we won't know how to simulate it. So it could be just a problem of conceptualization, making sense of this, and then proceed along those lines of reasoning. So that's what I'm going to do for my next experiments. But so far, this is as much as I've been able to come up with. So I hope you've enjoyed this video.